PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
This week on PA Books, Ed Simon, author of The Soul of Pittsburgh.
Ed Simon is the author of The Soul of Pittsburgh, Essays on Life, Community, and History. Ed, over the years you've left Pittsburgh and returned. How has that experience shaped your view of the city?
It's a good question. I think that it's given me kind of an ability to see these snapshots in time as the city changes. So it's the sort of thing where if I feel like if I'd been continuously here during that time, as these sort of like subtle changes happened, I might not have noticed just how different Pittsburgh has become over the past 5, 10, 15 years. So the kind of prodigal returning to Pittsburgh is a thing that's really impacted me in terms of just seeing the sorts of changes that have occurred here.
Now you say that for you consistently, you've always returned to landscape. Why is landscape so significant for you?
So this is one of the things I always joke when you're writing a book, you don't always know what exactly your argument is going to be. And I've written 2 books about Pittsburgh now, and I think my initial argument for both of them was basically, I'm from Pittsburgh and I want to write a book about Pittsburgh, and it wasn't much more involved in that necessarily. But in the actual writing of the books, I sort of stumbled around till I found an argument. In both of those cases, landscape was really central, I think, to thinking about what makes Pittsburgh distinctive, what gives this place a particular spirit in some ways. And because of Pittsburgh's landscape, it's so hilly, and you have the 3 rivers cutting through it, and you have, valleys and mountains, you can't help but be impacted by the idea of space in a really intrinsic way. So I think one of the things that makes Pittsburgh exemplary is the way in which landscape is built on here, the way it is experienced, the way it really defines our sense of self.
Now you reference a term from the Roman age, genius loci, if I'm pronouncing that properly, the individual spirit of place. Why is that significant for you?
I think that, every place, whatever it looks like, no matter how radically different it might be from the landscape here, has a particular genius loci, which I think is how you pronounce it too, but I'm not 100% sure. And I think that really what marks Pittsburgh's history is its particular genius loci. If you go to a flatter city, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on flatter cities, but if you're in a Cleveland or a Chicago, which are great cities in their own right, flatness defines them in a way that is very different from the hills here. And one of the things that makes Pittsburgh so different because of the hills is it gives, we talk about Pittsburgh as the city of neighborhoods, that it has 90 distinct neighborhoods, right? Give or take, depending on who's doing the math there. And they're oftentimes very unique or singular or almost distant from one another, even if they are in a literal sense right next to each other. And that's because of the landscape. If you have a valley that is separating two neighborhoods or a river or whatever. And so you kind of have a way in which you don't have one Pittsburgh, you have 90 or more Pittsburghs defined precisely because of our particular spirit of place. And I think that is one of the things that, there's not a uniformity to Pittsburgh. Sometimes newer cities will have a kind of blank and flat homogeneity, and that's not the case here, where you're in one neighborhood and you go 3 blocks down and it's an entirely different universe, it's an entirely different world. And that's, I think, especially for the relatively small size of Pittsburgh, a kind of unique aspect of the city.
Now, you write about a painter who did a series of 90 paintings for each of these different neighborhoods. When you look at a cycle of paintings like that, how does that artistic exploration of the city kind of reveal something about the city?
No, that's a great question. So that's the artist I was writing about. There is a guy named Ron Donahue, and he's a fantastic painter, and he's an open air painter. So everything he paints is outside, looking at whatever it is that he's painting, and he's got a tremendous eye for detail in sort of picking up things that are not necessarily the most obvious, but that people who live in an area or who are familiar with it might kind of pick up over years of familiarity with a place. So, it's funny that you bring him up because I had an opportunity to visit his studio, which I had not seen at the time that I wrote the book, but have subsequently seen as I've gotten to know him and become friends with him because of mentioning him in the book, and his beautiful one of his beautiful paintings is the cover of the book. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about Ron's work is when he takes something like he has this 90 neighborhood series, right, where he has a painting for each one of the neighborhoods. But he doesn't necessarily go the obvious route. So as an example of this, Oakland, which is one of the major neighborhoods in the city. It's kind of like our second downtown. It's where University of Pittsburgh and all the hospitals and Carnegie Mellon and the Carnegie Museums are located. And it's really dominated by this incredible building called the Cathedral of Learning, which is this 44-story tall Gothic skyscraper where Pitt houses a lot of its departments. So if I were going to paint something about Oakland, that would be the obvious thing to paint, right? In the same way, I'm going to do a painting of New York. Here's the Empire State Building, or Paris has the Eiffel Tower, or whatever. Ron's painting for Oakland there is actually a set of red doors at the Heinz Chapel, which is this gorgeous little building next to the Cathedral of Learning. And it's the sort of thing that if you lived in Oakland, if you worked in Oakland, if you walk by this every day, that might kind of impact in your mind more than if you were just a tourist or a visitor or something who's coming through the neighborhood. So in his series, he picks up on these like little details, like a strange house that maybe people who are neighbors would just notice over the decades or whatever, or an alleyway or a telephone pole or something. So he really gives kind of the poetic texture of the city in a way that if he was doing, something for the Visit Pittsburgh office or something, you might miss. And I think that he's really exemplary in picking up on that genius loci, on that spirit of place.
In the book, you say that your favorite neighborhood is one that doesn't technically exist. Why?
Yeah, so, I always say that Pittsburghers have these incredibly arcane discussions about where certain neighborhoods begin or end, because I think there are actual definite answers to that question at the city offices, whoever, the cartographers or whoever who chart those things out. But there's a lot of kind of in-between or unofficial neighborhoods, or kind of neighborhoods where things blur together or whatnot. And so one of my favorite neighborhoods, and I doubt this is many Pittsburghers' favorite neighborhood, but I have a real soft spot for it, is this area that we call the Limbo neighborhood. Or that I have called it that. It's more historically known as Automotive Row. And it's basically several blocks of Baum Boulevard and Center Avenue that run parallel to each other, from North Oakland all the way down to East Liberty. And it's uncharacteristically flat for Pittsburgh. So you have kind of like, two parallel streets that are parallel for quite a long time. They don't really circle back on each other or intersect each other oddly or whatever, which is something that happens quite a bit in Pittsburgh. And you have a number of different neighborhoods that it technically passes through. It goes from North Oakland through Shadyside, through Bloomfield, Friendship, and then down to East Liberty. Now, these are all really distinct neighborhoods. If you're in the center of any of those neighborhoods, they feel very different from one another. So Oakland's this kind of, very grand, monumental neighborhood of columned neoclassical buildings. It's where the universities are. It has kind of a tweedy intellectual feel to it. Shadyside is sort of an upper class Victorian housing neighborhood. Bloomfield, working class, Italian neighborhood, row houses. Friendship is kind of like a bohemian neighborhood with these old Victorian homes. And East Liberty is historically African-American neighborhood, has a number of developments that are coming into it, and sort of high rises and kind of miniature skyscrapers. And each one of them is really unique, but in this kind of back part of all of them, they share this limbo neighborhood. And it's kind of, it's not a pretty neighborhood. It's not a green neighborhood. It's kind of a little bit gritty. It has these sort of high rises and old warehouses and old factories that are being converted into things. But for me, it has this very atmospheric, very kind of urban feel that I've always been really attracted to. And I lived in that neighborhood for 2 years, many, many years ago. But it has a kind of noir sensibility to it that I really appreciate.
Now, in the book, you say that what you wanted to do was assemble a diary, a dream journal, a wooden shelf packed with interesting rocks and shells. Explain your approach. Talk to me about how you thought your way through this book.
Yeah, so I'm not a historian by training. I come out of a literature department, so I tend to view things through narrative more than I do through like archival evidence or something. And there's so many tremendous books on Pittsburgh history that have already been written that were entirely books that I relied on in a lot of ways for the more analytical type of stuff. What I was interested, rather than giving kind of an overview of Pittsburgh in its completism, was a sense of the things that I think personally are interesting or representative of the city, or that tell some sort of story about our identity or how we understand ourselves. So the first book about Pittsburgh that I read, which is called An Alternative History of Pittsburgh, and that came out in 2021. That was like a series of little historical vignettes about the history of Pittsburgh, and I wasn't very present necessarily in that book. Whereas The Soul of Pittsburgh is one where I think I'm a little bit more central, hopefully not too central, but I intervene a little bit more into the narrative. And there I'm interested in writing about what it means to be a Pittsburgher in the 21st century. So how do we understand ourselves? How do other people understand us? What's good about those things? What's bad about those things? And to that end, I'm interested in collecting interesting things that I find, rather than making kind of a cohesive, giant argument. So I look at things like, what does the Pittsburgh accent say about us? What is or how people view us? What do movies that were filmed in Pittsburgh say about us? What's the food that's associated with Pittsburgh say about us? So I like to think of it as a collection of things, in that sense, more than kind of an overreaching argument that you might get in a more traditional historical book.
Talk a little bit more about the essay as a literary form and how it allows you to explore what you're talking about. Essays tend to, an attempt to explore different things, and you can bounce around by association, and so it gives you a lot of freedom to work out the types of things you're talking about.
No, absolutely, and I mean that goes back to the origins of the essay as a form, back to Montaigne and the French essayist writing in the 16th century. And for him and people who kind of work in his stead, an essay is kind of an attempt, exactly as you said. It's an experiment. It's a way of kind of fooling around and seeing what you might find, right? So you can sort of free associate or tangentially jump off of things, or begin in a very different place from where you might end. And I think that there's a tremendous freedom, certainly, in being able to do that, even if you're writing about a very tangible subject like Pittsburgh. But you're not kind of shoehorned in as if you were writing a dissertation or an academic article or something. So, I do rely on citations and evidence and secondary sources and all of that sort of stuff. But I'm allowed by the genre's conventions to maybe be a little bit more speculative or lyrical with how I interpret and deal with those things than I would if I were working in a more traditional journalistic or scholarly form.
What is the connection between Glasgow, Scotland, and Pittsburgh?
Yeah, so this is, I always joke that if you can figure out how an essay or a book is going to begin, you're basically halfway done. So I think beginnings are a huge thing. And I struggled a lot with how to begin this particular book. And I decided that I wouldn't begin in Pittsburgh at all, that I'd rather begin in Glasgow, Scotland. So the largest city in Scotland. At one point, it was the second largest city in the British Empire. And it was a city that I lived in for about 6 months, 18 years ago now or so. I was studying there. and was there in the winter, which is a time that a lot of people avoid going to Scotland, as it is rather dark, cold, and dreary during that time. But one of the things that's really interesting about Glasgow, and it's a city that gets kind of put upon a bit, I think, in Britain. It gets made fun of a little bit. It has a reputation for being kind of tough and gritty and a little rough around the edges. And a lot of Glasgow really reminds me of Pittsburgh. And some of that when I lived there was in a very literal sense. The cities kind of look similar in some ways. Glasgow's a hilly city. It's in the Midlothians. It's not quite as hilly as Pittsburgh, but it's hilly. It has one river instead of three, but the landscape is a little bit familiar. And it's a post-industrial city. So it was a city that produced things. In their case, they were known for their shipyards. They're much closer to the ocean than we are, obviously. But it had a reputation for being this kind of working class, tough, gritty city. And the way I open up with Glasgow to kind of solidify that connection is I talk about, or I kind of imagine a conversation that I hear in Glasgow in which I hear a word that sounds an awful lot like yins. And I imagine a lot of your viewers probably know what yins is, but if they don't, it's the second person plural pronoun in the Pittsburgh dialect. So in the same way that a Southern accent, people will say, y'all, people in Pittsburgh say yins. And yins actually comes directly from Scots-Irish and Scottish dialects. So yins means you ones, which is a grammatical construction in Scotland. So you actually hear something that sounds an awful lot like yins in the same way in Glasgow. They spell it differently. They spell it with an S instead of a Z. And you'll hear yin as one, which you don't hear in Pittsburgh, but the form of it still sort of survives. So I use Glasgow as a way of talking about kind of the dual identity of both cities, their sort of shared history, and the fascinating ways in which we can kind of see parallels or see where we're from mirrored in places that can otherwise appear very, very different. And the way that I actually end the book, it's not a novel, so I feel like I can give a bit of a spoiler here, is I talk about how the Highland Mountains are actually the same mountain chain as the Alleghenies and the Appalachians are. So they literally are produced by the same geologic forces, and over 500 million years or whatever have been pulled apart by continental drift. But there's this, I think, very poetic way in how the language and the geology and the history, all of that connects us to this place that is otherwise very distant from us.
Now, one of the aspects of Pittsburgh is how it's portrayed in movies. And you talk about a movie from 1942 called Pittsburgh. What do you see in that movie, and what does that tell you about Pittsburgh?
So in that chapter, which is called Hollywood on the Mon, I talk quite a bit about how Pittsburgh has often been used as a cipher for certain things in movies. And that directly relates to Pittsburgh's reputation as this kind of working class industrial metropolis. And one of the things I argue is that Pittsburgh is a place like New York or like Washington or Hollywood that symbolizes something bigger than its literal self. So if we think of New York as kind of this like cultural capital, or Washington is used as a symbol for government, or Los Angeles and Hollywood for the movies and celebrity and entertainment, then Pittsburgh's always been this sort of cipher for work, for doing hard work, for doing industrial work, in a way that I don't really think any other city, not even Detroit exactly is. I mean, Detroit's so associated with the automotive industry, but Pittsburgh had such a kind of, steel, obviously, but then a number of other industries as well. So in Pittsburgh, which is a John Wayne movie, Pittsburgh, just the title of the movie itself is letting viewers in the 40s know that what they're seeing is this movie about hard work, about labor in the mills, about being working class, about making money and maybe ascending out of the working class, and that sort of thing. And I think that Pittsburgh, in varying degrees, has always kind of stood in for those things in Hollywood imaginings of the city.
Now, one of the movies that was very popular in the early 1980s was Flashdance. And normally people associate it with a lot of the music that was in it and the dancing, but there is a very strong Pittsburgh element to that as well. Yeah,
I write a lot about Flashdance, which was sort of a surprising a thing for me. I didn't think I would spend so many words on Flashdance, but it's a kind of amazing movie. You know, one of the things I joke is, in a literal sense, it's not a great movie. I mean, there's a lot that's kind of hackneyed or a little bit corny about it. And if your viewers aren't familiar with it, it's about a woman who is a welder by day and kind of like a very PG exotic dancer by night. And her dream is she wants to be a ballet dancer for the Pittsburgh Ballet. It's a, you know, kind of utterly ridiculous 1980s kind of big budget movie. And you're right, it's very much known more for its soundtrack than like the performance of the actors or anything in it. But at the same time, it is beautifully shot. Pittsburgh looks gorgeous in the movie. And as a kind of time capsule, it's fascinating because it's filmed right at the moment that the steel industry is collapsing. So it comes out in 1984. The big steel's in the process of collapsing. And none of that's really engaged with in the movie necessarily, but it's a way of seeing Pittsburgh when it was still a more populous city, before all of those changes that had happened when the city had kind of died and then been reborn. But one of the things that I think that's so interesting about it is because of its subject and because of the music, it's this kind of propulsive, hopeful sort of movie, despite what's actually happening in Pittsburgh at the time. And in some ways, I think, gave a cohesive imagining to a story that hadn't been written yet, where Pittsburgh can be reborn, where Pittsburgh is youthful, where Pittsburgh does have certain energy or dynamism to it. And I think if that wasn't necessarily true at the time, it's the sort of thing that has become true. And, you know, it was a tremendously popular movie. I mean, I think it did a lot for just people's awareness of the beauty of the city. You know, it's one of the things reviewers said is that at points Pittsburgh looks like Paris in the film. And, you know, there's some, you know, it's always a joke that Pittsburgh's the Paris of Appalachia. But it's a gorgeous city. And most people, based on the reputation or the jokes about the city, have historically not known that. So I think Flashdance was a really tremendous advertisement for that.
Another movie that was set in the area was The Deer Hunter, very different in terms of the vibe of the movie. It's a very heavy movie. How does that movie show something about the region?
Yeah, and that's mostly filmed in Clareton. But one of the things is I do know that they filmed part of it in the Pacific Northwest. So there's some scenes when the characters, who are all Ruthenian mill workers who get drafted to Vietnam, but they're out hunting. And there's like a mountain behind them that's like one of the Cascades or something. So there's this like craggy, snow-capped mountain that's a lot more mountainous than anything around here, which always like hits me whenever I see it. But The Deer Hunter has become kind of like the quintessentially Western Pennsylvania movie in a lot of ways, right? So kind of this story about first generation and second generation immigrant mill workers, working class. They don't necessarily have a lot of education. They're hardworking, patriotic. You know, they go off to fight in war, and they're kind of discarded by their sacrifices are discarded by their country, right? So it's this narrative that we see in how people talk about this part of the country, you know, Western PA, and then the broader Rust Belt all the time. I mean, you'll still see, like, I've seen editorials talk about, like, you know, voters in Deer Hunter country or whatever. And it's an old movie now. It's like a 40-year-old movie now. And as critically lauded as it was, I don't think it's quite in the broader conversation as much as some other classic Hollywood films are. But I think it speaks to how it's something that people kind of reach towards when they're trying to accurately or inaccurately describe what exactly Pittsburgh and its region mean.
Now, we can't talk about filmmaking and films in Pittsburgh without talking about George Romero.
Sure.
Talk about him and his significance.
Yeah, I mean, George Romero, who was the director of Night of the Living Dead and invented the entire Living Dead franchise, is the reason why Pittsburgh has the film industry that it does now. So Pittsburgh's film industry is huge. We're one of the largest filming locations outside of California and New York in the United States. I think that it was Movie Maker magazine ranked us like the third or fourth best city to live in if you work in the entertainment industry. And a big part of that is because the city is so varied, you can kind of film things in different neighborhoods and say they're different places. You need a scene in New York or Chicago, you film downtown. You need a scene in Washington, D.C., you film in Oakland. You need a scene in Southie Boston, you film in Greenfield or whatever. But that, in addition to the very generous tax breaks that are given to filmmakers here, are part of the reason the film industry is so huge. But another one is George Romero. And Romero is kind of this singular director. He's like a B-movie master, right? I mean, he's the sort of guy that I think maybe when his movies came out, if you were a fan of horror movies, you recognized them as something special. But it really took a generation or so until scholars and critics really acknowledged what was so powerful about his movies. And, if you think about the tremendous popularity of zombie films, The Walking Dead and 28 Days Later and all of these sorts of things, those are directly attributable to George Romero, who really invented a new type of monster. So he borrowed the, Haitian folk tale about a zombie, which was basically like a person controlled by a witch doctor, and he made it into something different. So it was kind of resurrected, soulless corpse that staggers around and just mindlessly attacks and devours people. And that's a really sort of terrifying elemental type of monster. And the fact that he's the guy that really came up with it, I mean, I think speaks to his genius, speaks to his quality of innovation. And a movie like Night of the Living Dead comes out 67 or 68, low budget black and white movie. They had to use chocolate syrup for blood. It showed up as kind of dark red, or not red, but dark on screen in the black and white movie. This movie made on a shoestring budget really launched 1,000 zombie franchises out of it. And he's just, or was, I should say, he's passed away now for a couple of years. Tremendous horror director. I think if he wasn't working in horror, which is sometimes dismissed or minimized, he would be recognized as one of the great new wave directors of the 1970s and 80s.
Now, you mentioned the film industry in Pittsburgh, and so much of Pittsburgh's identity is rooted around the steel industry, which, as you mentioned, we were talking about Flashdance, declined. And you also talk in the book about how more people work at Google than U.S. Steel. So how do these changes in workplace and industry affect Pittsburgh's identity today?
That's a really, really good question. And it's one I get asked variations of that quite a bit is, we still talk about ourselves as the Steel City, the Iron City, and so on. I think if there are any, there's Edgar Thomson Mill Works is still over in Braddock, and you have a few specialized mill things in the city, but most of those are like you have to have a PhD in metallurgy to work at them, right? And it's like 3 people. So you don't have the day of, Jones and Laughlin and Homestead Steel Works, and all of that is way, way in the past. And I think you have people who have deeper Pittsburgh roots who still have kind of a familial connection to that. I have both my grandfathers were in the Steelworkers Union, and I had family members on both sides that worked throughout Pennsylvania in the mills. But it's distant from people today. And as our population grows, thankfully, as more people come in, they have less of a connection to that. So in some ways, when we talk about the steel industry here, it's a little bit like, if you're in California talking about the 49ers, or if you're, out west and talk about cowboys or something, it's becoming increasingly kind of a mythic part of our past. I think it's a good thing that that's part of our understanding of ourselves. I think it should never be forgotten. I think it's central to our identity and should be. I think that if it's clung onto too much with a fantasy of manufacturing in that way as returning, it can be damaging, because I think that we're almost half a century beyond that moment. So there's a question of how do we reinvent ourselves now and do new things. But I think it is important to kind of honor that history and honor that past as well. And the best qualities of those sorts of, the people who worked in the mills, their kind of honor of labor, their honor of work, their honor of solidarity. I think that stuff should translate through, hopefully, to whatever it is that Pittsburgh defines itself as being. in the coming decades.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
You quote a Pittsburgh transplant who lives in Texas as saying, "We're all from Pittsburgh. It's just that the Pittsburgh we're from isn't there anymore." To some degree, there's nostalgia involved in this, and there's a sense of, especially if people leave, as you have, and come back, maybe the place you return to doesn't exist anymore.
That's very true. And any of your listeners who are from Western PA will know that the joke in Pittsburgh is that everyone directs themselves by landmarks that aren't there anymore. And oftentimes this is even done if they're things that weren't there when you were alive. You know, I'll direct people by like, oh, it's where the Isleys used to be, and the Isleys closed like 30 years before I was born or whatever. So history hangs deep in Pittsburgh in a lot of ways. I think if you grow up in Pittsburgh, a sense of history is really impacted upon you. There's also, in a really fascinating way that I've come to realize later, a way in which history has been preserved here in a manner that it was not in other mid-level sized cities. So because we had such economic devastation in the 80s and 90s, and then we kind of had our resurgence in the first decade of the 21st century when other places were undergoing similar sorts of things, we didn't have the kind of development in the 80s and 90s that would see lots of things cored out or ripped down. So downtown Pittsburgh has a tremendous number of Victorian skyscrapers, basically. They're kind of hidden between the much taller glass and concrete and steel skyscrapers. And that's the sort of history that I think you'd see erased in a lot of other places because they had the money to rip them down when they weren't thinking about it. And, you know, I bet a lot of people, you know, wherever, you know, miss those kinds of things. So we do have a kind of endurance of history here. But the city has changed rather radically over the last 15, 20 years. And I think it's a good thing in a lot of ways. I don't want to be, sometimes there's a knee-jerk anti-development kind of thing. And I think that we need to have change in Pittsburgh, a change that honors the past, of course, and tries to build on it and make it better. But I am interested to see, you know, and our population is growing very slowly, but it is growing for the first time in a generation, really. I think it'll be interesting to see how new Pittsburghers kind of orient themselves to that past history. I mean, one of the things I'll notice is that I think the entryway to a Pittsburgher's heart is relatively affordable. I mean, you kind of have to like us and like the Steelers, and you're kind of like in. And there's a certain affection, I think, and not uniformly, and I know people sometimes have different experiences with this, but, you know, when people embrace Pittsburgh, even if they're from somewhere else, I think there's a real enthusiasm for that. And I've noticed that a lot of people who transplant themselves to Pittsburgh kind of take all of it, right? Like they sort of like the grittiness, they like the post-industrial stuff. They're interested in that history.
You're talking about the preservation or the continuance of some of these older Victorian buildings throughout the city. And in the book, you talk about Allegheny Gothic. What do you mean by that? Why is that significant for Pittsburgh?
I think that, so this is a term I made up that refers to a type of, maybe a spooky or melancholy disposition. I think you experience in Pittsburgh, but then also in literature about Pittsburgh and movies about Pittsburgh. You know, we're a tremendously gray city in a lot of ways. I mean, it is an overcast, rainy place a lot of time, less so more recently. But I think that marks a lot of being in Pittsburgh. We also have this incredible Gothic architecture. I mean, Pittsburgh I used to hear the rumor that Gotham, the Batman city in the comic books, was in part based on Pittsburgh. You know, you think of Pittsburgh in the 20s and 30s when, because of the exhaust from the mills, it was basically nighttime dark in the middle of the day, oftentimes, right? And then you have something like the Cathedral of Learning, which is this Gothic skyscraper that looks exactly like something from Batman. It kind of gives the city a vibe or feel that I think is really kind of unique. And I like that sort of, you know, Halloween and August feel that you can sometimes get in Pittsburgh. It's a little bit haunted. We do have these tremendous Victorian skyscrapers. We have a number of, in a city, in a neighborhood like Lawrenceville or the North Side, these kind of tremendous 19th century homes that people still live in that have such a kind of concern for detail and molding and things that you don't get in newer dwellings that I think are really kind of singular here.
You say in the book that Pittsburgh is a metonymy for the nation. What is a metonymy, and how is Pittsburgh that for the United States?
Yeah. So metonymy is it's kind of like it's a rhetorical term, and it's similar to metaphor. But if a metaphor is something where you describe a thing by comparing it to something radically different, metonymy is where you describe a thing by something that's part of it. So an example of metonymy is if you call like a car a set of wheels or something, right? Since the car actually has wheels, but they become representative or stand-in for the whole thing. So I argue that Pittsburgh is a metonymy for America because I think the story of Pittsburgh, in terms of how it was founded on the frontier, the fights between labor and capital, between industry and the environment, themes of immigration and nativism, all of that is tied up in Pittsburgh in a way that I think makes Pittsburgh a stand-in for the entire American story. And in part in the book, I compare that by saying, when we say New York, we mean energy and power and money and culture. When we say Washington, D.C., we mean power and government. When we say Hollywood, we mean entertainment and celebrity and spectacle. When we say Pittsburgh, we mean industry, but we also mean something that I think is quintessentially American in a very particular way.
Now, this connects to the issue of symbolism in cities as well, and how different elements of a city, whether it's a building or some type of structure, often becomes a symbol of that city. So when you look at Pittsburgh, what types of symbols do you see?
Yeah, so I try to figure out what exactly is our kind of totemistic symbol, like in the way that the Empire State Building is for New York, or the Eiffel Tower is for Paris, or Big Ben for London, or whatever. And I take a look at a number of different candidates. So I talk about the incline, which is the funicular that goes up and down Mount Washington. Anytime you watch a Steelers game or whatever, they will have a shot of the incline. It's a relatively unique thing in the United States. The bridges, of course, I think are representative of the city. We always claim that we have more bridges than any city in the world other than Venice. I think it's like an arguable statistic, but there are a lot of bridges, excluding all the kind of, concrete overpass bridges or those sorts of things. Downtown, you have dozens of oftentimes gorgeous, beautifully engineered bridges. The Three Sisters bridges, which run from downtown to the north side, which are three golden truss bridges in a row, you will oftentimes see as a kind of visual shorthand for Pittsburgh when you see them. I talk a little bit about the paper streets, which these are these are streets that are stairs, basically. So they're called paper streets because they're only streets on paper or on Google Maps, I guess, as it is now. But every so often, like a normal street will hit a hill that you couldn't actually put a street on, and then a flight of steps goes up them to get to whatever is on the top. A little less famous than the other things, but uniquely a kind of Pittsburgh thing. Or the Cathedral of Learning is kind of a symbol of Pittsburgh. And I conclude that chapter by saying that I think of Pittsburgh stained glass as intrinsically Pittsburgh. And this goes back to what I was saying about these gorgeous old Victorian homes. A lot of homes in Pittsburgh have these kind of expertly crafted, gorgeous stained glass windows that go back to probably between the 1880s and 1920s, whenever the house was built. And even very modest, you go by a very modest row home or something, and you'll see like gorgeous stained glass window on one side of it or something. I think it's because these homes weren't, they stayed in families for generations, or they weren't ripped down to build new things 30, 40 years ago, and they've endured in a way that sort of thing hasn't maybe in other cities. But it's part of what I think gives Pittsburgh that spirit of place that I write about.
19th century writer Charles Dickens traveled the United States, and he visited Pittsburgh. What did he see?
So he oftentimes the quip that Pittsburgh is hell with the lid off is attributed to Dickens, and he actually isn't the one who said that. It was a writer for The Atlantic who was writing, I think, in like the 1880s, so like a good 30 years after Dickens had been here. But when Dickens was here, he didn't have like much that was more positive to say. Pittsburgh was tremendously filthy and smoggy and dirty at the time. And, you know, it was a much smaller city when Dickens visited, on its way to becoming ultimately a much bigger city than it is today. But you know, you're talking about Pittsburgh during the Industrial Revolution, before there's any clean air and water laws, before you have the EPA or anything like that. And it is a sooty, dirty, sulfurous city. And that's the reputation that in some ways has endured even until today. You know, the city at least appears much cleaner than it used to be. The air quality is still not that good. But you know, that kind of sense of Pittsburgh as this grimy, grubby, dirty, besooted kind of place. And Dickens has, you know, some really arresting descriptions of what the city looked like at that time. And he's visiting in, let's say, like the 1850s, I think.
Many cities have an iconic food that's associated with them. Are there iconic foods associated with Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's going to instantly go to like a Primanti Brothers sandwich there, which I read a little bit about. Primanti Brothers, venerable strip district headquartered sandwich chain. It's the sandwich where you get your fries and the coleslaw on the sandwich. It's something that, and you know, like once a year I get my hankering for Primanti Brothers. I think it's more out of towners that really enjoy them, but it's kind of viewed as quintessentially Pittsburgh. But I, in my chapter on Pittsburgh food, talk a little bit about, you know, some of the usual suspects, like things like chipped ham, or you know, city chicken, which is like a breaded pork chop, basically. But I also talk a little bit about forgotten kind of high cuisine types of things. So I talk about something called the Turkey Devonshire, which was kind of like a white tablecloth mid-century meal that was sort of comparable to Louisville's hot brown sandwich. It's like an open-faced, baked turkey sandwich in a cheese sauce. It's probably like 8,000 calories or something. It's really delicious and increasingly rare to find. But it's interesting because, I mean, I think so often when we talk about like Pittsburgh food, we think of like bar food sort of stuff. And this is an example of something that was supposed to be, I mean, it would be tremendously out of fashion at a fine restaurant today, but in the 1950s and 60s, it was intended to be kind of, you know, a fancier sort of thing. And then the Pittsburgh food scene has changed quite a bit. You know, we were named by Zagat's as one of the best food cities in the world, I think like 9-10 years ago. Every year, a couple of different chefs in Pittsburgh will become James Beard nominees for Best Chef in the Mid-Atlantic. So they're competing against chefs in New York and Philly and Washington, D.C. I end that, or I don't know if I end the chapter with it, but I talk about a present-day restaurant called Aptica, which is in sort of the border between the Garfield and Lawrenceville neighborhoods. Their chef has been nominated for a James Beard Award, and it's this vegan restaurant, which seems so, you know, for like kind of meat and potatoes shot in beer Pittsburgh, seems like such an incongruous thing. But it is also a Polish restaurant. So it sort of is a fascinating way of reinventing something quintessentially Pittsburgh in a way that's a little bit more 21st century.
What comes to mind when someone says Steelers Nation?
Steelers Nation. So I think, you know, the Steelers have such a huge, huge fan base outside of the region. I mean, I suspect that the Steelers are a lot of people's second favorite team if they're not from here, right? I remember, and this goes back to Glasgow, I was on Buchanan Street in Glasgow, and I saw a woman in a Steelers jersey walking by, and I ran up to her and I said, Pittsburgh, are you from Pittsburgh? And she said, no, I'm from Mexico City. I said, why do you have like a Heinz Ward jersey on? She said, we all love the Steelers, right? So there's this way in which the Steelers, I think because of what they represent as kind of this like bare-knuckled, tough, blue-collar, working-class, pugilistic way of playing football is endears them to many. I mean, and they're a popular team because of that historically, and also because they certainly have had their share of wins over the years, which goes a long way to explaining that. But then Steelers Nation as a term sort of refers to like the greater Pittsburgh, the kind of way in which Pittsburgh is understood or enthused about in places that aren't Pittsburgh. And in part, that's because there's a very large Pittsburgh diaspora. I mean, there's a lot of people who moved away when Big Steel collapsed. I mean, the population of Pittsburgh at its height was 600,000 people, and it was among the top 10 largest cities in the United States. Now we are under half of that almost. And the city proper itself is like way down the list in terms of its size. And obviously it's different when we talk about metro area, and some of those people moved to suburbs and so on. So it's a little bit more complicated. But you did have a lot of people from Pittsburgh who moved to the Sun Belt or who moved to Virginia or places like that. And they brought with them their Steelers enthusiasm and passed it on to their kids, and in some cases their grandkids. So you have people who are diehard Steelers fans who may have never even been to Pittsburgh. And I think in part it's because of what the Steelers represent in relationship to Pittsburgh and what Pittsburgh represents. It's one of the things where there are, and it was the art gallery at CMU did a taxonomy of this, or a census, I should say, of this. But there are Steelers bars in every state of the country and in like dozens of countries, right? You can be in Bulgaria or wherever and find a Steelers bar. And that's an odd thing. Like, I don't think that there are, I mean, I could be wrong in this, but I don't think there are like Seattle Seahawks bars in Bulgaria. I could be wrong. I'll correct myself if I'm wrong, but I think that there's something that the Steelers represent that is different and attractive to people.
Who was Joe Magarac?
So he's basically Pittsburgh's Joe Bunyan. He's our kind of folkloric, mythic character. So Joe, I guess Magaric, I think is how you say it, but I'm not 100% sure. He was supposed to be a steel worker who could work 24 hours a day. And was incredibly strong. He was like a John Henry kind of figure. And then he sacrificed himself when the furnace was overheating by like jumping into it, and I guess that cooled it down enough to save everyone or something. And then they used that steel to build the Capitol Dome in some versions of the story. It's a very weird type of legend because it can't actually be substantiated whether this was an actual folktale or not. It's attributed to a Scribner's Magazine author who was from Pittsburgh originally, but had come back and was in a bar on the South Side, and a group of Eastern European mill workers told him, like, oh, this is a story that we all talk about. The last name actually means donkey in Slovakian, I think. And so there's some hypothesizing that all of these like hardworking values and attributes that are associated with him are actually, they're kind of making fun of him as being sort of like dim-witted or slow. And that the Scribner's author kind of took this at face value as like a real folk tale that people told, but really it's something that anthropologists call fake lore, basically like a fake myth that was constructed. But then the story of Joe Magarac kind of took on a life of its own in some ways. So at the Edgar Thomson Steelworks, there's a tremendously weird statue of him that's made out of steel. At the Kennywood Amusement Park, they used to have, it may have actually been the same statue now that I think, they may have moved it at a certain point. There's a tremendous Art Deco representation of him downtown on the building that GNC used to have its headquarters in. They didn't put it there, but they moved in there and he was there. And I see him like around his visage, right? You'll see it on, murals or things or whatever. So this is kind of like vaguely tongue-in-cheek folk tale, and I think it's quintessentially Pittsburgh in that way too, because it's like a little bit funny and a little bit sarcastic.
Now, many cities have parks or memorials that reveal something about how they remember themselves as a city. One of those in Pittsburgh is Point State Park, and how does that kind of just show us the way that Pittsburgh thinks of itself in its past?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Joe Mazurak because there'd actually been some discussion at one point of putting a huge memorial to him there, like a statue of him. Right now, Point State Park, so it's right at the confluence of the Monongahela and the Allegheny, where the Ohio River begins, and it's where Fort Pitt and Fort Duquesne had been in the 18th century. Until it was redeveloped, it was basically like a rundown area of like warehouses and old factories, and you had bridges and highways that kind of went over it. And during the Renaissance project in the 40s and 50s, when they began basically redeveloping a lot of things, it was turned into a state park at the very tip of the Golden Triangle, kind of like Battery Park in New York at the tip of Manhattan. And it's a big, gorgeous green space in the midst of downtown. There had been, and it's got this, gorgeous fountain that's at the bottom of it. There had been a number of different discussions about how that space could be used. So one was this Mazurak Memorial, which was going to be this bizarre statue of Joe Mazurak kind of turning over two cauldrons of steel that were going to be fountains that were going to be shooting illuminated orange water out of themselves. It would have been such a weird looking memorial. It's probably good they didn't do it, but part of me is sad that it's not a real thing. Frank Lloyd Wright had actually been enlisted by Richard King Mellon, who was the founder of the Mellon Foundation, tremendously wealthy financier. And he had designed a rather futuristic kind of design for what he wanted to do with the point where it was going to be kind of a number of terraces and domes and things going out over the river, and there was going to be like a concert hall and a stadium and apartment buildings and things, and it was abandoned for being too expensive. Though some of those designs, Wright later on repurposed when he designed the Guggenheim in New York. But the space that's there today, probably underutilized in some ways, but it's just kind of a gorgeous green entrance, I think, to the city.
Another one of Pittsburgh's parks is Mellon Park. If we were to walk through it, what would we see?
So Pittsburgh, a lot of people are surprised by how green Pittsburgh is. I mean, not all of it and not in all places, but we have a park service that I think is one of the nation's best. So you have Frick Park and Schenley Park, and these are massive parks. But Mellon Park is kind of a quintessential urban park, and it's built on, I don't know if it's Andrew Mellon or Thomas Mellon, one of the Mellons had a mansion at that site that was ripped down, and his land was donated to the city, and it was turned into this park. So it's between Shadyside, Point Breeze, and Squirrel Hill, three different neighborhoods, and very close to East Liberty. And it's kind of set in with this wrought iron fence, this kind of very atmospheric Pittsburgh Gothic, Allegheny Gothic fence. And it's just a gorgeously sculpted, elegant park. I think it's one of America's great urban parks. It has a gorgeous Elizabethan rose garden that they're in the process of restoring. It still maintains some of the old Tudor red brick walls of the Mellon Mansion, which kind of give it this very sculpted English garden kind of feel. It's where the Pittsburgh Center for the Arts was located, so it has this kind of dynamic museum that's right in the midst of it. And when you're there, it's on a hill, of course. You've got the view of traffic on Fifth Avenue and kind of the towers of the city beyond, but you're in this very kind of peaceful repose of a place. And so for me personally, it's always been one of my favorite parks. And there's so many to choose from.
You write about how Pittsburgh has produced a wealth of literary writers, and you use the term the Pittsburgh School. What are you talking about?
Yeah, so I was interested by if we could say if there's something that unites the variety of authors that came out of Pittsburgh. For a city, a relatively, like a medium-sized city, we really do hit above our weight in terms of people that we've produced. So, Gertrude Stein is from Pittsburgh originally. August Wilson, probably the greatest American playwright of the 20th century, set 9 out of 10 of his plays in Pittsburgh's Hill District. John Edgar Wideman, Annie Dillard, Michael Chabon, Stuart Onan, and lots of incredible poets as well. I mean, Jack Gilbert, Gerald Stein, W.D. Snodgrass, Jan Beatty. And one of the things that I asked myself is what unifies all of these figures, because they're very different writers. And I think that there is a sense in trying to find something transcendent amidst that which is prosaic in life. And I think it comes from the kind of very real material reality of Pittsburgh that is, defined by landscape, defined by industry that can be incredibly dangerous, but that you have moments in the city because of those very same things that are profoundly beautiful. So it's this way of kind of finding the sacred within the profane or whatever. And there's a quote from Gilbert's a tremendous poet, East Liberty born, spent most of his life outside of the city. He lived in San Francisco and New York and Greece and Japan. It was everywhere, but he wrote about Pittsburgh all the time. And before he went to college, he'd been a mill worker. And he told an interviewer for the Paris Review that it's hard to think small in a steel mill. So that when you're surrounded by this thing that's so much bigger and more powerful than you and is sort of sublime, that it really impacts your kind of spiritual vision. And I think that that quality is really common in a lot of writers that have spent time or are from Pittsburgh.
You also write about Hugh Henry Breckinridge and his novel, Modern Chivalry. If you read that novel, what do you find?
So I should first off say that Modern Chivalry, I think to most contemporary readers, is not very good in a lot of ways. It could lay claim, though, to being the first novel written in the United States. Hugh Henry Breckinridge he's kind of like Pittsburgh's Benjamin Franklin, in that he was our autodidact polymath who did everything. He was in government and he founded what became the University of Pittsburgh, and he founded what became the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And he was kind of like the most educated guy in the 18th century and did all of these things. Modern Chivalry is his attempt to write a version of Cervantes's Don Quixote for the United States, but it entirely takes place in what was at the time the Western frontier. So the sort of Allegheny backcountry of Western Pennsylvania. It's certainly an interesting book. I think it's just written in a style that's hard for a lot of modern readers. But it does have moments of humor and levity in it, and I think a sort of understanding of the kind of hard-nosed democratic impulse that existed in the backcountry at that time, and that in some ways still endures today.
Well, we've been talking about the book, The Soul of Pittsburgh, Essays on Life, Community, and History. Ed Simon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.